My stepfather treated me like garbage for 15 years. Now he needs a kidney and I'm the only match in the family. Growing up, I never imagined that one phone call would turn my entire world upside down and force me to confront 15 years of pain I thought I had buried forever. The day started like any other Tuesday morning in my small apartment across town from where I grew up. I was making coffee and getting ready for another ordinary day when my phone buzzed with a number I hadn't seen in over 3 years. When I was 7 years old, my mother remarried after my biological father passed away from cancer. At first, everything seemed like it might work out. My new stepfather appeared charming during the courtship phase, bringing flowers for my mom and occasionally a small toy for me. But once the wedding rings were exchanged and we all moved into his house on the other side of town, his true personality emerged like a storm cloud that never quite passed. The transformation was gradual at first, then overwhelmingly complete. He would make comments about how I was too loud, too messy, too much trouble. When I would accidentally spill something at dinner, he would sigh dramatically and mutter about how some kids just couldn't be taught proper manners. My mother, desperate to make her second marriage work after losing my father, would quietly clean up the mess and give me warning looks that meant I should apologize immediately and try harder next time. By the time I turned 10, the subtle criticism had evolved into something much more cruel. He would compare me constantly to his friends' children, pointing out how they got better grades, participated in more activities, or seemed more respectful. Nothing I did was ever good enough. When I brought home a report card with mostly A's and 1 B+, he would focus entirely on that single B+ and lecture me for 20 minutes about mediocrity and wasted potential. When I tried to show him a drawing I had made in art class that I was particularly proud of, he would glance at it for maybe 2 seconds before suggesting I spend more time on homework instead of silly crafts. The worst part wasn't even the direct criticism. It was the way he would light up when my mother's sister would visit with her kids, my cousins. Suddenly he became this warm, encouraging father figure, asking them about school, complimenting their achievements, and even offering to help them with projects. I would watch from the corner of the room as he displayed all the parental warmth and support that I craved but never received. Then, the moment they left, he would return to treating me like an unwelcome guest in his home. As I entered my teenage years, the emotional distance became a chasm. He would make decisions about household rules that clearly targeted me while exempting my mother. I wasn't allowed to have friends over because the house needed to stay clean for his colleagues who might drop by unexpectedly. I couldn't play music in my room because it disturbed his concentration when he worked from home. Even something as simple as leaving a glass in the sink would result in a lecture about responsibility and respect that could last an hour. My mother, caught between her daughter and her husband, began to retreat into herself. She would make weak attempts to defend me occasionally, but mostly she seemed exhausted by the constant tension. I could see the guilt in her eyes, but she never found the strength to stand up to him in any meaningful way. Instead, she would pull me aside privately and beg me to just try to get along better, to be more understanding of his stress from work, to remember that he was providing for our family. The breaking point came during my junior year of high school. I had been working incredibly hard to maintain good grades while also participating in several extracurricular activities, hoping desperately to earn a scholarship to college so I could finally escape the suffocating atmosphere at home. When I received news that I had been accepted to a prestigious university with a partial scholarship, I was absolutely thrilled. I rushed home to share the news, thinking that maybe, finally, he would acknowledge that I had achieved something worthwhile. Instead, his first response was to calculate how much money the family would still need to contribute for my education. He spent the next hour explaining how my college dreams were going to create a financial burden on the household and suggested that maybe I should consider staying local and attending community college instead. He made it clear that while he wouldn't prevent me from going, he certainly wasn't going to celebrate the achievement or make any sacrifices to help make it happen. That night, as I lay in bed listening to my mother and stepfather argue in hushed voices down the hall about college expenses and family obligations, I made a decision that would define the next decade of my life. I was going to find a way to make college work entirely on my own, and once I left for school, I was going to minimize contact with this house and the man who had made my adolescence so miserable. The next 2 years were a blur of part-time jobs, scholarship applications, and careful financial planning. I worked at a local grocery store after school and on weekends, saving every penny I could for college expenses. I applied for dozens of scholarships, writing essay after essay about overcoming adversity and pursuing educational dreams. My stepfather never once asked about my progress or offered encouragement. In fact, he seemed almost annoyed by my determination, as if my success would somehow reflect poorly on his own parenting approach. When I finally left for college, the goodbye was awkward and brief. My mother cried and hugged me tightly, whispering apologies that we both knew were too little and too late. My stepfather shook my hand formally and wished me luck in a tone that suggested he didn't really care whether I succeeded or failed. As I drove away from that house for what I thought might be the last time, I felt a mixture of relief, sadness, and determination that fueled me through my first semester. College became my refuge and my opportunity to discover who I really was without the constant weight of disapproval. I threw myself into my studies and campus activities, making friends who appreciated my personality and encouraged my ambitions. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe freely and explore my interests without judgment. I chose a major that genuinely excited me rather than one that might impress my stepfather, and I began to build relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. During school breaks, I would return home reluctantly, mostly because I missed my mother and felt guilty about leaving her alone with him. Each visit reinforced my decision to limit contact after graduation. The dynamic hadn't changed at all. If anything, my stepfather seemed even more dismissive of my college experiences, treating my education as an expensive hobby rather than a serious investment in my future. He would make snide comments about how college was making me think I was better than my family, or how all that education wouldn't matter if I couldn't find a decent job afterward. Update 1. After graduation, I moved to a city several hours away and began building my adult life completely independently. I found a job that challenged me and paid well enough to support myself comfortably. I made new friends, explored romantic relationships, and slowly began to heal from the emotional wounds of my childhood. My contact with home became increasingly sporadic, a phone call to my mother every few weeks, brief visits during major holidays, and polite but distant interactions with my stepfather when necessary. My mother would occasionally try to guilt me into visiting more often or maintaining a closer relationship with my stepfather. She would tell me that he asked about me sometimes, or that he was proud of my accomplishments even if he didn't express it well. I knew she meant well, but I also knew she was trying to rewrite history to make herself feel better about the choices she had made during my childhood. The truth was that my stepfather had never shown genuine interest in my life, and I saw no reason to pretend otherwise just to maintain family peace. For about 5 years, this arrangement worked reasonably well. I built a life that made me happy and fulfilled while maintaining just enough contact with my family to avoid complete estrangement. I rarely thought about my stepfather except during those awkward holiday gatherings where we would exchange pleasantries and count down the minutes until I could politely leave. Then everything changed with that phone call on a Tuesday morning 3 years ago. My mother's voice was shaky and strange when I answered, and she immediately asked if I was sitting down. My stepfather had been diagnosed with kidney disease. The doctors said it was genetic and had been progressing slowly for years without obvious symptoms. He was going to need a transplant within the next few years to survive. The family had all been tested for compatibility, including my mother, my stepfather's brother, and his adult nephew. None of them were suitable matches. The doctors explained that sometimes step-relatives could be compatible even when blood relatives weren't, and they recommended that I get tested as well. My mother's voice cracked as she made the request, clearly understanding how awkward and complicated this situation had become. My first instinct was to refuse immediately. Why should I potentially undergo major surgery to save someone who had made my childhood miserable? Why should I put my own health at risk for a man who had never shown me genuine love or support? The irony wasn't lost on me that after 15 years of treating me like I didn't belong in his family, he now needed something that only I might be able to provide. But as I sat in my apartment that morning, staring at the phone long after my mother had hung up, I realized the situation was far more complicated than my immediate emotional response. This wasn't just about my stepfather and me. This was about my mother, who would have to watch her husband die if no donor could be found. This was about the kind of person I wanted to be, regardless of how others had treated me in the past. I spent the next several weeks in emotional turmoil. I would wake up some mornings feeling generous and mature, ready to take the high road and get tested regardless of our history. Other days I felt angry and resentful, convinced that I owed this man nothing and that my mother should have protected me better during my childhood if she wanted my help now. I talked to friends, but most of them had never experienced anything quite like this situation, so their advice felt well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful. Finally, I decided to get tested, but not for the reasons my family might have expected. I realized that I needed to know whether I was compatible so that I could make a fully informed decision. If I wasn't a match, the question would be resolved without any action on my part. If I was compatible, then I would have to confront the deeper moral and emotional implications of the situation. The testing process took several weeks and involved multiple appointments, blood draws, and detailed medical evaluations. During this time, I had limited contact with my family. My mother would call occasionally to check on my progress, but she seemed afraid to push too hard or ask directly about my intentions. My stepfather, predictably, never called or reached out personally. Even facing a life-threatening illness, he apparently couldn't bring himself to have a direct conversation with me about the situation. When the results came back, they confirmed what I had both hoped for and dreaded. I was indeed a compatible donor, and according to the medical team, I was actually an excellent match with a very high probability of transplant success. The doctors explained the risks and benefits of donation, the recovery process, and the long-term implications for both of us. They were professional and thorough, but they also made it clear that the decision was entirely mine and that I should take as much time as I needed to decide. That night, I sat in my apartment with a bottle of wine and tried to imagine how my life might unfold in either scenario. If I donated the kidney, I would undergo major surgery with real risks, face weeks of recovery, and potentially have ongoing health considerations for the rest of my life. But my stepfather would live, my mother would be relieved, and I would know that I had chosen compassion over resentment. If I refused to donate, my stepfather would likely die within a few years unless another donor could be found. My mother would be devastated, and I would have to live with the knowledge that I could have saved someone's life but chose not to because of old grievances. The family relationships would probably never recover, and I would carry the weight of that decision forever. Update 2. The next few months were the most emotionally challenging period of my adult life. I had told my mother that I was compatible but needed time to make my final decision. She respected my request for space, but I could hear the desperation in her voice during our brief phone calls. She never directly pressured me, but she would occasionally mention how my stepfather's health was declining or how the doctors were becoming more urgent about finding a donor soon. During this time, something unexpected happened that completely changed my perspective on the situation. I received a call from my stepfather's brother, someone I had barely spoken to over the years. He asked if we could meet for coffee, saying he had something important to discuss with me. Curious and somewhat suspicious, I agreed to meet him at a neutral location halfway between our cities. What he told me during that conversation shattered many of my assumptions about my childhood and my stepfather's behavior. He explained that my stepfather had grown up in an extremely abusive household with an alcoholic father who had been violent and unpredictable. As a child, my stepfather had learned to suppress his emotions and maintain rigid control over his environment as survival mechanisms. He had never learned how to express affection or connect emotionally with children because he had never experienced those things himself. His brother went on to explain that my stepfather had actually spoken about me often over the years, expressing worry about my well-being and pride in my accomplishments, but always in private conversations where he felt safe to be vulnerable. He had apparently been terrified of forming too close a bond with me because he was convinced that his own damaged emotional state would somehow harm me the way his father had harmed him. In his twisted logic, maintaining distance had been his way of protecting me from his own psychological wounds. This revelation didn't excuse the pain I had experienced or magically heal the wounds from my childhood, but it did provide a context that I had never considered. My stepfather wasn't just a cruel man who enjoyed making a child miserable. He was a deeply damaged person who had never learned healthy ways to love or connect with others, especially children. His coldness toward me had been rooted in fear and self-protection rather than malice or indifference. His brother also shared details about my stepfather's current emotional state. Apparently, the kidney diagnosis had forced him to confront his own mortality and the relationships he had damaged throughout his life. He was reportedly filled with regret about how he had treated me, but felt too ashamed and proud to reach out directly. He had asked his brother to speak with me not to manipulate my decision about donation, but to ensure that I understood the full truth about our complicated history. As I drove home from that coffee meeting, my mind was reeling with conflicting emotions. Part of me felt validated that my stepfather did care about me in his own broken way, but another part of me felt angry that it had taken a life-threatening illness for these truths to come to light. Why hadn't anyone explained this to me during my childhood when I was desperately trying to understand why I seemed to be such a disappointment? Why had I been allowed to carry the burden of feeling unloved and unwanted for so many years? Over the following weeks, I found myself thinking constantly about cycles of damage and healing, about how trauma gets passed from one generation to the next, and about the power we have to break those cycles through our choices. I realized that regardless of my stepfather's psychological wounds or his hidden feelings about me, I still had the power to choose how the story would end. I also began to think more seriously about my mother's position in all of this. She had been caught between a daughter she loved and a husband whose emotional limitations she probably understood better than I did. While I still felt hurt that she hadn't protected me more effectively during my childhood, I began to understand that she had been trying to navigate an impossible situation with limited tools and emotional resources. The turning point came when I received an unexpected package in the mail. Inside was a small wooden box containing a collection of items I had never seen before. There were report cards from elementary school with handwritten notes in my stepfather's writing, newspaper clippings from school events I had participated in, and even some of my childhood artwork that I thought had been thrown away years ago. At the bottom of the box was a letter in my stepfather's handwriting. The letter was awkward and stilted, clearly written by someone unaccustomed to expressing deep emotions. But the content was devastating in its honesty. He acknowledged that he had failed me as a parental figure and that his own childhood trauma was no excuse for the pain he had caused. He wrote about how proud he was of the woman I had become, despite his inability to provide the support and encouragement I had deserved. Most importantly, he made it clear that he didn't expect or feel entitled to my kidney donation and that he would understand and respect whatever decision I made. The letter ended with an apology that felt genuine and complete. He took full responsibility for his failures and expressed deep regret for the years of emotional distance and criticism. He also thanked me for considering donation despite everything, calling it a level of grace and maturity that he didn't deserve but deeply appreciated. After reading that letter multiple times, I realized that my decision about the kidney donation had evolved into something much larger than a simple medical choice. This was an opportunity to break a cycle of pain and resentment that had defined our family dynamics for decades. I could choose to perpetuate the hurt by refusing to help, which would be completely understandable and justifiable. Or I could choose to respond with compassion despite everything, creating a different kind of legacy for our family story. The choice, I realized, wasn't really about my stepfather at all. It was about the kind of person I wanted to be and the kind of life I wanted to live. Did I want to carry the burden of resentment and missed opportunities for the rest of my life? Or did I want to choose healing and generosity even in the face of past hurt? Final update. I called my mother on a Thursday evening and told her that I had decided to donate the kidney. Her relief was audible through the phone and she began crying immediately. She thanked me repeatedly, but I made it clear that I wasn't doing this for gratitude or recognition. I was doing it because I believed it was the right thing to do regardless of our complicated history. The surgery was scheduled for 6 weeks later, giving both my stepfather and me time to prepare physically and emotionally. During those weeks, we had several conversations that were unlike any we had ever shared. They were still somewhat awkward and formal, but there was an underlying honesty and vulnerability that had never existed before. He expressed his gratitude multiple times, but he also made it clear that he understood the magnitude of what I was doing and didn't take it for granted. The most surprising conversation happened just a few days before the surgery. My stepfather asked if I would be willing to hear about his childhood and his relationship with his own father. I agreed, partly out of curiosity and partly because I sensed this was important to him. What followed was a painful but illuminating discussion about generational trauma, learned behaviors, and the ways that damaged people often damage others unintentionally. He told me about growing up in a house where affection was seen as weakness, where children were expected to be invisible and undemanding, and where any show of emotion was met with ridicule or violence. He described how he had promised himself as a young man that he would never treat children the way his father had treated him, but then realized as an adult that he had no model for healthy parenting or emotional connection. His coldness toward me hadn't been intentional cruelty, but rather the only way he knew how to interact with a child without risking the kind of explosive anger that had defined his own childhood. This conversation didn't magically erase the pain of my adolescence, but it provided a framework for understanding that helped me process those experiences differently. I began to see my stepfather not as a monster who had enjoyed making me miserable, but as a deeply wounded person who had done the best he could with the emotional tools he possessed. It wasn't enough to excuse his behavior, but it was enough to open the door to forgiveness and possibly even a different kind of relationship going forward. The surgery itself went smoothly for both of us. The medical team was incredibly professional and supportive throughout the process. I spent several days in the hospital recovering, and my stepfather's room was just down the hall. My mother spent most of her time shuttling between our rooms, clearly emotional about the whole situation but also relieved that we were both doing well. During my recovery, something beautiful and unexpected happened. My stepfather began visiting my room regularly, not just to express gratitude but to actually talk with me about my life, my interests, and my experiences. For the first time in our relationship, he asked genuine questions about my job, my friends, and my goals for the future. He listened attentively to my responses and offered thoughtful comments and observations. It was like meeting him for the first time as a real person rather than just an authority figure. These conversations revealed sides of both of us that had been hidden for decades. I learned that he had always been interested in many of the same books and movies that I enjoyed, but had never felt comfortable sharing those interests. He discovered that I had inherited some of his analytical thinking patterns and problem-solving approaches, despite our lack of emotional connection during my formative years. We found common ground that neither of us had ever bothered to explore before. The recovery process took several weeks, during which we had numerous opportunities to interact in low-pressure settings. Without the daily stresses of work and household responsibilities, we were able to focus on simply getting to know each other as people. My stepfather began sharing stories from his adult life that revealed his sense of humor, his professional challenges, and his genuine love for my mother. I began to see him as a complete human being with strengths and weaknesses rather than just the distant authority figure who had made my childhood difficult. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after the surgery, my stepfather did something that completely surprised me. He asked if I would like to see some photo albums from his childhood and young adulthood. As we looked through the pictures together, he pointed out family members I had never met and told stories about his experiences growing up. Many of the photos showed a young man who looked sad and uncertain even during supposedly happy occasions like birthdays and graduations. But the most meaningful moment came when he pulled out a separate album that I had never seen before. It was filled with pictures of me throughout my childhood and adolescence, school events, birthday parties, graduation ceremonies, and casual family gatherings. He had been documenting my life all along, even though he had never shared his interest or pride at the time. Seeing those photos, carefully organized and preserved over the years, made me realize that his love had always been there, even if he hadn't known how to express it in ways that I could understand. The physical recovery from surgery was challenging but manageable. Both of us experienced some discomfort and fatigue for several weeks, but the medical team had prepared us well for what to expect. More importantly, both kidneys began functioning well immediately, and my stepfather's overall health improved dramatically within just a few weeks of the transplant. But the emotional recovery and growth that occurred during this time was far more significant than the physical healing. My stepfather and I began building a relationship based on mutual respect, honest communication, and genuine affection. It wasn't the father-daughter bond that I had craved as a child, but it was something valuable and meaningful in its own right. We also began addressing some of the specific incidents from my childhood that had caused the most pain. My stepfather would bring up particular memories and acknowledge how his behavior had affected me, offering specific apologies and explanations without making excuses. I was able to share how certain moments had shaped my self-perception and my relationship with our family. These conversations were sometimes difficult, but they helped both of us understand each other's perspectives and begin to heal old wounds. My mother, watching these interactions unfold, became emotional frequently during my recovery period. She told me later that she had always hoped my stepfather and I would find a way to connect, but she had never imagined it would happen under these circumstances. She also apologized for her own role in enabling the dysfunction, acknowledging that she should have been more assertive about creating space for healthy communication between us during my childhood. As I prepared to return to my own apartment and resume my normal life, I realized that the kidney donation had accomplished something I never could have anticipated. It had given my stepfather and me an opportunity to know each other as adults, free from the complicated dynamics of parent and child. We had discovered that we actually enjoyed each other's company and had much more in common than either of us had ever realized. 6 months after the surgery, our relationship has continued to evolve in positive ways. We talk on the phone regularly, not just about health updates, but about books we're reading, current events, and random thoughts about life. He has begun sharing more stories about his work experiences and asking for my perspective on various professional challenges. I have found myself looking forward to these conversations and appreciating his insights and humor. The most surprising development has been his interest in making up for lost time. He has asked me to recommend books and movies that I think he would enjoy, and he has started reading and watching them so we can discuss them together. He has also begun planning activities that we can do together during my visits home, from hiking trips to visits to museums and cultural events. It's like he's trying to create the positive memories and shared experiences that we missed during my childhood. Looking back on this entire experience, I'm amazed at how one difficult decision led to such profound changes in our family dynamics. The kidney donation was initially about saving my stepfather's life, but it ended up saving our relationship and creating possibilities for connection that I never thought possible. It taught me that people can change and grow even later in life, and that healing is possible even after years of pain and misunderstanding. I don't regret my decision to donate the kidney despite the physical challenges and emotional complexity of the situation. In fact, I'm grateful that circumstances forced us to confront our relationship and find a way forward together. My stepfather will never be the warm, encouraging father figure I wished for as a child, but he has become someone I genuinely care about and enjoy spending time with as an adult. The experience has also changed my perspective on forgiveness and family relationships in general. I learned that forgiveness doesn't require forgetting or excusing past hurt, but rather choosing to release the anger and resentment that can poison your own happiness. I also learned that family relationships can be redefined and rebuilt at any stage of life if both people are willing to be vulnerable and honest with each other. Today, almost a year after the surgery, both my stepfather and I are healthy and thriving. His kidney function remains excellent, and I have experienced no complications from the donation. More importantly, we have built a relationship that brings joy and meaning to both of our lives. We may have lost the opportunity to have a traditional father-daughter bond during my childhood, but we have created something different and valuable that suits who we are as adults. Sometimes the most difficult decisions lead to the most unexpected blessings. I'm grateful that I chose compassion over resentment, healing over hurt, and love over fear. It has made all the difference in both of our lives.